Today we're going to be configuring 4 different types of NAT. Firstly, static NAT for this subnet here, dynamic NAT using an ACL and a NAT pool here, Nat Overload with PAT, which is using the router's outside interface, and Nat Overload with PAT using pools for this one, and then these two sub interfaces. So first, in static NAT, it's basically divided into 3 main parts. The first 2 are the easiest. You'll have to configure the router's inside interface using the IPNAT inside command. So that would be this router right here, and its G01 interface pointing towards its own little private subnet, and the outside interface using the IPNAT outside command, which is the S000 pointing towards ISP. Lastly, you will have to configure the private and public IP address mapping that's going to be used. You can do this by using a IPNAT inside source static, and then the private IP to be converted, which is also the inside local in the command line here, just private IP, and the public IP, which is the IP to be converted public. In the command line, it is also referred to as the inside global. So firstly, configure the router's inside interface using the IPNAT inside command. We'll also have to put an IP on this. So interface G00, we're going to give it a 0.1 default gateway for this PC here as well. So we went into the interface, gave it an IP, /24 mask, did a no shut to bring it up, and an IPNAT inside. Now we just need to go to the S000, the link that's facing towards the ISP, IPNAT outside. In this template here, all of the links and interfaces on these routers facing the ISP have already been configured with IP addresses. We will still be using the IPNAT outside on the interfaces just in case. And after that's done, we now have to configure the private and public IP address mapping. So we have an IPNAT inside source static, and then we'll have our private IP that we want to be converted to the public IP, and I've identified these down here as well. Inside source, static, then the inside local IP, which is our 192.168.0.30. Oops. And the public IP. Do it again. Do a 31. And we now have 2 IPs to be converted. So we can hop on this host here, ping any of these IPs out here for internet access. It might take a few seconds, but we should get connectivity. As you can see, we can also verify this by using a do show NAT translations. Do show IPNAT, I mean. Here you can see all the entries we have in for our public IPs and our private IP. You can also do a show IPNAT statistics. Outside interface, that's the one pointing towards the ISP. Inside interface, RG01 pointing towards our own subnet. 3 hits, 4 misses, pretty typical. Moving on, we'd be going to dynamic NAT, which uses an ACL to define the traffic that's allowed to go out to the internet, and a NAT pool to determine what public IPs are going to be used. So we'll be using this subnet here, ACLs for the 1.0 subnet with a /24 mask. And the pool here will be 11.11.11.1 through 11.11.11.14 with a /28 subnet mask, which is a .240. Same 2 commands as earlier, the first 2 at least. IPNAT inside, IPNAT outside. Then we'll need to configure the ACL for the list of inside source addresses that will be translated. And then we'll be doing a pool of global IP addresses to use, so the public IPs that we're going to need to use with this command. Then we'll need to bring both of them together with an IPNAT inside source list. So it's saying that we're using a ACL list here, and then the pool name, the Nat Pool. So go ahead and get started. So we have a simple access list here. Permit anything in the 1.0 subnet, and it is using wildcard bits. Hopefully you guys know that by now. If you don't, it's just a regular subnet mask but inverted. So if you have a 255.255.255.0, that's a /24, invert that, 0.0.0.255. That's our access list. Now we're going to do an IP NAT pool. We'll call it NAT with the start address 11.11.11.1, end address 11.11.11.14. Then a net mask to specify the network mask, which is a 255.255.255.240, the /28. Now we need to bring those both together with an IP NAT inside source list, because we're using an ACL. That list was number 1, and a pool because we're using a NAT pool. And I apologize, we actually had these swapped around. So we're supposed to do the IP NAT inside and IP NAT outside first. That's okay, as long as you get it done. And now we should have internet connectivity. Might take a few seconds, but should be good to go. No translations yet. You can see it did take a few seconds. But we have internet connectivity. So the translations, we had none earlier because they hadn't gone through yet, determined by the request timeout. We had no hits, no misses. We just didn't give it enough time. Translations, now we have our public entries and our private entries. Statistics, 7 hits, 8 misses. Alright, now we'll be moving on to Nat Overload with PAT, which is just NAT using the outside interface of the router to be converted. So this S001, I believe, yes, we're using this subnet, and this will also involve an ACL with the 192.168.2.0 subnet. First two commands, IPNAT inside, IPNAT outside. Then we'll need to configure the access list for all the subnet that we want to be able to be translated. And then we will enable PAT, just NAT with PAT overload with the IPNAT inside source list, then the ACL interface, and then we'll do an S000 here, and then overload at the end to make sure it's PAT. Go ahead and copy the easy commands. IPNAT inside, FA00 right here. IPNAT outside on the S00 outside link. Now our access list, This is just a pretty simple access list permitting anything in the 2.0 subnet. Wildcard bits. Oh, whoops. Just realized I put that on the interface itself. You can see it automatically took you here back to global config when I did it. Accidentally ran that on the interface, but brought me back. Now we'll need to bring that ACL along with the interface here to configure NAT with PAT overload. So we'll do in IPNAT inside source list 1 for our ACL interface serial 000, and then an overload to make sure it's using PAT. And that should be all that's required. Now we should get some internet connectivity here. Right away we do. Just make sure. Do show IP NAT translations and statistics. Entries, hits and misses. You can also double check to make sure you're putting them on the wrong interface or the right interface. Now we're on to the final one, configuring NAT Overload PAT, but with a pool. So we'll be doing it here for this subnet here first. So we're going to configure this one from scratch using a pool. But first let's go to the interface. So FA01, IP NAT inside, and we'll do IP address 192.168.3.1, 255.255.255.0. Doing an access list for the 3.0 subnet. We'll do number 1, permit anything in the 192.168.3.0 subnet using wildcard bits. Just to make sure I didn't skip that. Well, I kind of did, but we'll have to put the IP NAT outside on the serial interface. Now we'll need to bring that with a IP NAT pool. Call this one NAT as well. And see the addresses that we're supposed to use are in the 22 subnet here. 22.22.22.8/29. That is 8 usable, or 8 total addresses, 6 usable. Start address 22.22.22.9. End address 22.22.22. If I can do my mental math, 15. The net mask 255, 255, 255, 248 is a /29. That is our pool. Now we'll need to bring both of those together here with an IP NAT inside, source, list 1, pool, NAT, overload. If I didn't forget anything, we should have internet connectivity on this subnet here. And we do. We can verify by do show NAT translations, IP NAT, and statistics. We're good there. Now we'll be doing the same exact thing, but we're using the VLAN, so sub interfaces here. So we're going to go back to the steps here. First two are the easiest, IP NAT inside and outside. We'll need to configure an access list for both of these sub interfaces, 30.0, 192.168.30.0, which is VLAN 30, and 192.168.40.0, which is VLAN 40. These will also be using PAT, so overload. And then the IP NAT pool, using all the public IPs to be converted. Looks like we'll be using 33.33.33.0 with a /30. So that will start at .1 and a .2. /30 is 4 available addresses, 2 usables. And then we'll need to enable PAT with the overload command. Alright, so first we'll need to configure the sub interfaces. Hopefully you guys know how to do that now. We'll need to do a subinterface.30 for the VLAN 30, encaps that, and give it an IP, and also make sure to put the IP NAT inside on your individual sub interfaces as well as the interface that's on. So on FA00 we have two sub interfaces. We need to do the IP NAT inside on both of those, as well as doing it on the actual link, the actual interface that those sub interfaces are resting on. So we'll go ahead and just copy all this. Those are good. Also put the IP NAT outside for the interface 00. Just copy that, paste that. And then we'll need to configure an access list for both of those subnets, both of those sub interfaces, those VLAN 30 and 40. Those are done. Now we need to configure the pool of public IPs to use. So we'll do an IP NAT pool. NAT, we'll call it NAT 33.33.33.1, 33.33.33.2. So that is the start IP, end IP. Specify the net mask, which is 255, 255, 255.252/30. Now we need to bring both of those together. IP NAT inside source list 1 pool NAT is the name of our NAT pool, and then overload to make sure it's pat. Now after all that's done, I'm sorry, we were on this step right here. After all that's done, we should have internet connectivity on all of these hosts. Check out this guy as well. There we go. We have PCs from both subnets. You can verify here and with statistics. So if you're ever missing anything, any entries in here after configuring NAT or here, if you don't have any entries, definitely got some NAT config wrong, and all of these commands here, these will be very much help. I think that's about all I have for you folks today.